Possibility. It is the religious value of loving what is possible that draws so many people to Unitarian Universalism. There's a church that believes in that. There's a church that has room for all the things I think. There's a church that has room for me to grow, but accepts me as I am. Where do I sign up? And the answer is here. Once again, Pathways, noon today, if you're interested. This is certainly true for me. The possibility, what is possible to believe and what is possible for humans to accomplish together are the things that have drawn me into this religious community of Unitarian Universalism. And earlier this week, I was looking through, I don't know, maybe I'm the only one that does this, a stash of like little Post-it notes and scraps of paper I'd written quotes on and little ideas that I jotted down that I wanted to keep somewhere. I have like a box of them at home. I have a box and an envelope and a box in the office and probably a few in my purse, honestly. But I was looking back specifically at some notes I had made to myself around the time that I was becoming a fellowshipped Unitarian Universalist minister and going and having my interview in front of the fellowship committee. And the Post-it note that stuck out to me was a Ani DeFranco lyric. And it said, "I do it for the joy it brings because I am a joyful girl, because the world owes me nothing and we owe each other the world. I do it because it's the least I can do and because I learned it from you." And I thought, this perfectly encapsulates my idea of humanism. And I was so excited that I found it to start this sermon off with. But then I found an even better note that I had written to myself. And that note had exactly 3 words, and they're in Italian. Eppur si muove. I'm not very good at languages. And it was even more perfect, because these words, eppur si muove, translate to, and yet it moves. These words, and this might be a story or it might be fact, these are the words that Galileo said as he was being taken from house arrest to another incarceration after he attempted to do the exact same thing that Copernicus had attempted to do in a previous generation of study. And yet it moves. The church had decided that he would be punished for having the notion that the earth revolved around the sun and having the audacity to tell other people this idea. And his response was, and yet it moves. Whatever the church might say, he knew that the laws of nature would not bend to the will of religion. And when I was trying to encapsulate my beliefs, when I was preparing to see the Ministerial Fellowship Committee, and I was making all these little notes to myself, this particular batch, you try to kind of encapsulate your beliefs and the foundational wisdoms into very pithy sound bites so that you can impress the committee. And so I took a lot of these little notes and things that you can say yes to. I definitely believe that this is true. This is a theological label that I can claim. And this was part of my preparation for seeing this fellowship committee, which would ask me many questions, and I wanted to have really good, concise, clever answers. And it led me into, I won't say it was a crisis of faith, because crisis implies a bad thing, but it led me to the inevitable conclusion that here I was getting ready to become a Unitarian Universalist minister, prepared to serve a congregation of Unitarian Universalists, and the only spiritual, theological, or philosophical label I could claim unequivocally with integrity is, I am a humanist. There are many other labels that like 90% fit the bill, but they all had a disclaimer. The only thing I can say unequivocally is that I am a humanist. Right now, we are in the midst of a season of studying the sources of our faith. And some of those sources appeal to us more than others as individuals. The teachings from the world's religions, teachings from earth-centered traditions, Jewish and Christian teachings, the words and deeds of prophetic men and women. These are some of the sources that we will look at in future months. But the thing that I think is interesting about this particular source is that I think it's really tough to be a Unitarian Universalist without embracing this particular source. The same can be said of the direct experience that we talked about last week. Both of these speak to the idea of possibility, that religion can be about more than dogma, about more than creed, that a religion can be centered around the work of this world rather than the hopes and fears about the next, which is a country that, by definition, we cannot visit in the material form. Now, if you were in the sanctuary with me here today, I would ask you, by a show of hands, who has been asked some variation on this question. Well, if you don't believe in God, what keeps you from going out and murdering people? I will raise my hand for all of us. And my response is always some version of, what is wrong with you? Are you saying that if you didn't believe in God, you would go murder people? If fear is the only thing that keeps you from feeling entitled to go out and take a human life, that seems like pretty weak tea. As a religion, let's try a stronger brew. Humanism, in its essence, is about having an enduring faith in human capacity and potential. Not the perfectibility of humanity or the absolute sovereignty of humanity, but in its capacity and its potential. And at the heart of this faith lies another virtue, and that is choice. If I am not free to choose without divine coercion to do good, to care for my world, to love my fellow humans, to work for the betterment of all, to discern for myself what right and wrong look like and how the moral good plays out in my life. If I am not free to figure those things out for myself, then I cannot actually know whether I am a good person or not. All I can know is how well I can follow someone else's rules. And if you've been around here long enough, you probably know that following someone else's rules has never really been my highest priority, which is probably how I wound up here. One of the things that I find interesting in preparing for these services around our sources of our living tradition is that all of them have some kind of extra little bit, right? This one is humanist teachings and the wisdom of science that counsel reason. And then it has this extra bit talking about cautioning against the idolatries of the mind and spirit. And I thought that was pretty juicy. A quick story. About 25 centuries ago, in the Aegean Sea, there was a glorious awakening of thought and reason and human curiosity. Around this time, Greek philosophers who were studying the natural world had the idea that we might all be made up of these very tiny particles that are part of everything. They had the idea that humans and animals may have evolved from simpler forms of life. People were tossing around the idea that diseases were not caused by gods and that the earth was maybe just a planet revolving around a sun that was very far away. These were some of the earliest people who were trying to make cosmos out of chaos. The idea that the universe was knowable in some sense, that it was ordered by principles and not entirely unpredictable and subject to the capricious whims of whichever god was dominant in that moment, in that location. This was one of the first moments in the Western world where science and mysticism butted heads and parted way, when nature and the gods found themselves at odds. Thales was one of the particular philosophers who took this approach, who said the world was not made by the gods, but was the result of material forces interacting in nature. He brought astronomy and geometry to Greece. But when we are asked to name the great Greek philosophers, I would suspect that many of us would not include the name of Thales or any of his colleagues, despite their discoveries about time and space and evolution and humanity's place within the material world and the Earth's place in the cosmos. Because in the 6th century, 25 centuries ago, Ionia, as that part of the world was called, was also home to another tradition whose founder was Pythagoras. We've probably heard of him. He does the thing with the triangles, right? And for him, he believed fundamentally that there was a mathematical harmony under all of nature. He was the first to use the word cosmos to describe this structure. And we are indebted to him for that. And there were some deep ironies and contradictions to his thought. He believed that the laws of nature could be discovered by thought alone. He was not an experimentalist. He was a theoretician. He was a mathematician. And he believed that the truth could be found in that metaphysical sense, expressed through mathematics. Things like the 5 regular solids. For example, if you are familiar with Pythagorean stuff, there's the idea that there's 5 perfect solids in the world and they make up everything. It's very complicated. And it messed up Johannes Kepler pretty bad down the road a little bit. So rather than seeking knowledge through experience and experiments, they found those experiments threatening when they contradicted this theoretical perfection of math. This led to things like the suppression of the square root of 2 and hiding the existence of the dodecahedron from the populace. Instead of using wisdom to advance civilization, they preferred the crystalline perfection of abstraction to the messy reality of the world. Following Pythagoras, we also would probably think of Plato as one of the great Greek philosophers we're familiar with. And one of the things he is most famous for is this idea that the world of thought was more real than the world of experience. There was a perfection in thought that was preferred to the complexity of life. And this was the beginnings of that mind-body dualism and split between experimental science and theoretical religion. This mind-body dualism inhabits so much of Western thought, and it all started there. The lesson in this for me is that we should be skeptical even of our skepticism. As excellent and revolutionary as this thinking was, it also planted the seeds for a lot of the suffering and discontent that we experience in the world today. We heard earlier from Dr. Lakhani, and he was speaking a bit about the way monotheistic religion falls apart under empirical study. He says, it's necessary sometimes to use a ploy, but recognize its limitations. The problem with going one way or another, if we go in the direction of matter and the material world are the thing that is real and the theoretical is not, well, let's think about that atom. When you think about an atom, you go inside the atom. What is deeper in the atom? We have electrons, we have quarks, And at some point, we find that we are moving into the theoretical rather than material, even though we started out by talking about an atom, which is in the material world. Because beneath all this material existence is a theoretical underpinning, a metaphysical reality, modern physics. Material reality is an appearance of the mathematical underpinnings of that material reality. My humanism means that I live in hope. Dr. Lakhani might call it a spiritual humanism, and he does later in his talk. The material world is how we express our reality and experience our reality. But we also have a metaphysical reality, whether that is the underpinning of mathematics and physics, or the underpinning of spirit, or a little bit of all of it put together. My humanism means that I live in hope, and I work hard to keep the faith in our ability to live in both worlds. Because really there is just one world. And I find it hard sometimes these days to keep my faith in humanity. After a year and a half of living through a pandemic that has claimed over 500,000 lives in this country alone, 4.5 million worldwide, the greatest wonder of my present moment is why we are not all in sackcloth and ashes today. Along with Dr. Lakhani, I wonder too, what kind of deity could I believe in? Certainly not the omnipotent one in the supernatural sense, because that God does not sound like a very nice guy. Another scrap of my memory from the very first class I took as becoming a Unitarian Universalist was a quote from Ralph Waldo Emerson from his Divinity School address, which shook things up a lot in the 19th century. And he challenged us to dare to love God without mediator or veil. He proposed a counterweight to formal religion that was not necessarily atheism, but a personal religious consciousness and a self-reliance, based on his belief that divinity was apparent in the nature of all. Dare to love God without mediator or veil. Rather than taking the best qualities and virtues in our life and putting them onto an external source, we can reclaim them and therefore love God without mediator or veil. And we can love people. Humanism, to me, is that loving God without mediator or veil. It is a recognition that in choosing, we can also not choose. That is also a choice. We can choose not to choose between the material world and the metaphysical world. We can recognize that there is just one world, a direct connection between my own consciousness and that same spark in each of us, as well as our material connection to all that is. We are the cosmos, grown to self-awareness. We are star stuff, studying the stars.